Hello everyone, this is Miss Siddiqui here. Now that you've had a chance to read chapters 1 through 4 of the Scarlet Letter, in this video I'm going to summarize the key points of these chapters and kind of analyze some of the significant plot developments, symbols, and character development. So chapter 1 is very short. It's 2 pages, and this chapter is more about showing the setting. We become familiar with the viewpoint of the narrator as this third-person, omniscient narrator who knows about the colony. So the colony is where our story takes place. We realize that it's a Puritan settlement in Boston. It's the 17th century. So one thing that really sticks out in this gloomy imagery, this dark and drab scenery in these first 2 pages is this rose bush. So other things that this chapter does, it introduces the concept of sin. There's a reference to Adam and Eve. So we know that this novel is going to focus on sin and the Puritans' belief that we are all born sinners. And one thing that's interesting about this chapter is that it points out that the world of the Puritans, of the colonists, has already fallen apart even though they've moved to this paradise of the New World that they were so hoping for, because what they've had to do is build a prison and a graveyard. And this prison is described as having this overgrowth of weeds, there's rust, and then beside it grows this wild rose bush, which is a contrast amongst the kind of darkness of the prison. So no characters are really introduced in this chapter, it's just all about setting. So amongst the rust, decay, and ugliness, this kind of rose bush emerges. So we're supposed to kind of think, in this gloomy setting, what could this rose bush symbolize? So this scene marks 2 landmarks, the prison and the cemetery, which point to the themes of punishment and death, which are prevalent in the novel. So, you guessed it, the rose bush represents Hester. She is wild, she is beautiful. This chapter also makes references to Anne Hutchinson, which is, she's called sainted in this chapter, which is of course ironic because we know that she was a dissenter. So we know that this narrator is somewhat sympathetic to Hester, and that also nature is sympathetic to Hester. So basically the language in this chapter shows the bias on the part of the narrator, even though he knows everything about everyone's actions and thoughts in this novel. So in chapter 2, we kind of see this big crowd, and Hester is making her way to the scaffold from the prison. And we learn through the bits of dialogue, or hearing bits of conversation in the crowd, that Hester is having an illegitimate child from an affair, and she, basically the women in the village are talking about, oh, Hester got off easy, they're treating her with this really strict, cold judgment, which would have been typical of Puritan women. And then we learn that the A is stitched in gold and scarlet and represents that she is an adulterer. In this scene, we also see Reverend Dimsdale for the first time. And the crowd is silent, waiting for her to walk out onto the scaffold. What's interesting is that Hester kind of seems surprised because she might have expected some sort of scolding, but really the crowd, as they watch her go onto the scaffold, is dead silent. And then this chapter says at one point she sees somebody in the back of the crowd, but in this chapter we're not quite sure who this person is and why he matters so much. But then, as you know, we'll find out in chapter 3. So this chapter focuses again on this Puritan belief that sin is not just something that needs to be dealt with between the individual and God, but in public. Sinners should be publicly charged and kind of pointed out as examples. And what's interesting about this chapter is that the way that the narrator tells it is that there's this kind of smug righteousness to this whole scene that really makes the reader think, well, I think it's not just about keeping virtue and making sinners examples. I think it's about something else here. And it kind of alludes to this idea that publicly humiliating sinners allows the crowd and the other Puritans to kind of fool themselves into thinking, well, oh, I'm not that bad, my sins are not as bad as Hester's, let's shame her so that kind of we can feel better about ourselves. So the symbols in chapter 2, the marketplace represents the Puritans' safe place where order resides, the center of the town where things are transparent, nothing is hidden. And then the town, of course, is gathered outside the prison door, which leads to the scaffold. So we kind of discovered that this community is a little bit twisted. It's very black and white. They have no distinction between the degrees of sin and punishment. Everyone is treated the same. And everyone is kind of viewing this as, like, this is a huge criminal offense, like, we need to witness this. So it's kind of interesting to see how invested they are in punishing adultery. So the scaffold is part of a system of punishment to promote good citizenship. So if you see people on the scaffold, the idea is that you will recognize that you shouldn't be doing those kinds of things. So it's basically a way of creating a non-example for the citizens of the Boston Puritan colony. So what's interesting here is the kind of the contrast between the women and Hester. So the women gossip. They're described as hefty and rotund. They're country women. They're coarse and not refined. They're sort of manly. They're associated with darkness and conformity. Yet on the flip side, Hester, a sinner, is ladylike, elegant, refined, dainty. She looks saintly. Again, the irony of that, like Anne Hutchinson. She's creative. And she also radiates light. So you can see through this contrast of women and Hester in the first few chapters that the narrator is kind of biased towards Hester. So chapter 3 is called The Recognition. And this recognition is that Hester's husband, who she thought was dead or missing, is actually alive. So in this chapter, it reveals that Hester was sent ahead from Europe by her husband, and that Hester has been in the Boston colony for 2 years without any word from her husband, and no one in this town knows who he is. So he was lost at sea and was shipwrecked. At times he was living with the natives. So because Hester was with child, she was not executed for the sin of adultery. And then also she was not given the death penalty because they didn't know if her husband was dead or not. So what punishment she was given is standing on the scaffold for 3 hours a day and wearing the symbolic letter for the rest of her life. So what we uncover in this chapter is that Hester's husband encountered problems in crossing the Atlantic to getting to the New World. And at some point he was held captive, and basically he had these problems that delayed him from reaching Hester. So you'll find out that Hester's husband is upset that the baby's father is not sharing in the public punishment. Hester's not going to reveal the father of the baby, so we know that she's been in prison, on the scaffold, wears the A. But that's not enough. The people of the town want her to confess the father, but she won't. So one thing to really pay attention to in chapter 3 are the 3 men who question her, and they're basically considered like the town fathers or the town guardians. So there's Governor Bellingham, which is fit that he's the governor and the leader. So he is basically not sympathetic towards Hester. And he sort of represents all the rest of the Puritan society. There's Reverend Wilson, who talks about sin and references the A throughout the sermon. So again, there's that symbol. And then there's Reverend Dimsdale, who is the young minister who's very well respected and well known for being devout and having intelligence. And he does the questioning, and he actually encourages Hester to fess up about it all. So in this scene, you should notice how heavily Dimsdale says, like, you should reveal the father, you should not hide his sin, you know, even if he's a man of high status. He even uses the word, like, it would be hypocrisy, things like that, which we know is ironic. And what Hester says is, would that I could endure his agony as well as mine. And it is clear from this line that she loves her baby's father. She does not want to reveal him. So what's interesting in this passage is this passionate appeal by Dimsdale to Hester to please reveal the baby's father. It's only right that he also not be able to hide his sin, kind of just because of the biology of it. You know, she's visibly pregnant and has to bear that burden, but the father can kind of slink into hiding. So it's kind of one of the strongest examples of irony in the book, and there's this strong undercurrent of personal meaning in Dimmesdale's public remarks to Hester in this questioning scene. So in chapter 4, which is called The Interview, we're back in the prison cell, and Pearl is convulsing in pain, and so the baby's upset, and Hester's not well. So Hester's husband poses as a physician by the name of Roger Chillingworth and does not reveal that he is married to Hester. So although fearful that he might harm the baby, Hester allows Chillingworth to come in and help, and Hester accepts sedative from him. So the sedative calms Hester, and Hester and her husband talk intimately and sympathetically, and they kind of both accept blame for the current situation. So Chillingworth doesn't want, revenge against Hester. He's not furious about it. And he says, I shouldn't have married you. I was old, but Hester, you also shouldn't have been unfaithful. So what Chillingworth then becomes kind of obsessed with is knowing who violated his marriage. And you'll notice through the first 4 chapters, Chillingworth is kind of sometimes associated with snake imagery. It's no surprise that his name is Chillingworth, so he kind of has this coldness to him. And since Hester is concealing the identity of her lover, Chillingworth requests that Hester keep his identity a secret because nobody in the colony knows their connection. So Chillingworth promises not to take the life or damage the reputation of her unknown lover if Hester won't give the name of Chillingworth or won't say that Chillingworth is her husband. And also Chillingworth warns Hester if she fails to keep his identity secret, then he will hurt Pearl's father. So this is one of the more dramatic chapters of the book regarding the development of Chillingworth. So we see what he has been and what he has become. So Chillingworth is this lonely, initially gentle scholar who's been robbed of his wife. And now he has this element of self-destruction in him and this grim determination to discover the man who has caused him this offense and has impregnated his wife and has caused her to be an adulterer. So what we learn from this chapter is that Hester never pretended to love her husband. Hester does deeply love Pearl's father because she's willing to protect him. And it's Hester's concern for Dimmesdale more than her sense of obligation to Chillingworth that persuades her to swear to keep her husband's secret. And we will find out that this promise will make Hester and her lover suffer later in the book. So at this point, I want you to think about what's in store for Hester. What is it going to be like navigating Chillingworth and his demands and keeping his identity a secret? And how will life be for Hester with this and taking care of this baby alone?